Hello everyone, my name is Eric Smythe and I'm going to deliver a brief demonstration on how QuerySurge integrates with Visual Studio and Visual Studio Team Services. So before we start, a couple points. You'll need to install the QuerySurge command line integration component as well as the test tool connectors during the QuerySurge installation. Those components are required in order to deliver this type of implementation. So if the command line integration component is installed with QuerySurge, if you go to the QuerySurge installation directory, you'll see a CLI folder. Inside of that folder, you'll see a couple files that are required for the command line integration, and you'll also see a samples folder which will provide some sample files for the different types of integration that QuerySurge has. I want to draw your attention to the C# files that are provided. These are sample files that can be loaded into your project, which provides as wrappers around the command line integration, which actually does the QuerySurge test execution. So I'm going to navigate to a Visual Studio instance. This Visual Studio instance has those same sample files created into a C# unit testing project. You can pretty much use these files as they are. You only need to change a few parameters in order to connect to your particular QuerySurge instance as well as the specific test suites that have been created in QuerySurge that you want to run. So the first file we're looking at is the QuerySurge connection CS file. And what you'll see is there's a couple parameters listed at the top. One is for the installation directory. This is where QuerySurge is installed on whatever machine you're accessing. Second is the host name. This is the machine that is hosting QuerySurge. And then third is the port, which is the port that QuerySurge is running on. Once those global configurations have been set, then you can go to one of the specific C# files which contains the test that you're going to run. So I'm looking at the scenario by suite ID. What this contains is a sample test method which is going to execute a QuerySurge suite of tests. So for this particular test method, the test method is called zCityAll table test. What that's going to do is it's going to run all tests against our source database, which is called zCity, and compare it to the tables in the data warehouse. You'll see we have a couple parameters defined at the top of the test. One is the user that's going to be used to log into QuerySurge. The password is actually saved in a properties file inside of the command line adapter. It gets encrypted after the first time it executes. The scenario name is what's going to be created when you run the test. This is how the test run is going to be referred to as. So you'll see here we're just doing zCityAll, indicating it's running all the query pairs against this source system, and it's going to put a date and time stamp associated with that as well. We're just running a single suite of tests, so the suite ID is 1. You can also execute multiple suites with a single test by comma separating in the suite ID numbers. You can either execute the suites by ID or by name. There's a different sample file which is used to do it by name if you choose to do it that way. And then the last parameter is the output path. This is where you want the results file that's going to be generated from the execution of the suite to be stored. This should be stored in a shared directory somewhere on your network that the QuerySurge server will have access to. So once you change those parameters, you can go ahead and run this particular test method. So I'm just going to right click and hit run test. You'll see in the test explorer the test is starting to be executed. I'm now going to navigate over to our QuerySurge run dashboard, and what you'll see is that that particular suite of tests is starting to execute. You'll see the graphs and the statistics continue to go as the test runs. Once the suite has been completed, you'll see it's 100%. You'll see we had 23 query pairs pass in that suite and 2 failures. If I drill into the results. You can see the couple query pairs that did have failures, and then if you want you can go ahead and drill into those and actually see both the results of your source system and your target system, the source system being the results on the left and then the target system being the results on the right. And what you can see is this status field for a few of the records. There was a pending status which was supposed to be transposed to an incomplete status, and the transposition didn't get done correctly, and that's why you have pending in the source and incomplete in the target system. So that the indication of an error that something went wrong. So if I close this and I navigate back to Visual Studio, you'll see the results of that test was a failure. If we go to the output of that failed result, you'll see that there is a HTML file that gets generated, and what that HTML file will contain is it will contain the query pairs that we were just looking at with their pass or fail status. And if I drill into the particular result links that are on this HTML file, it'll take you into the QuerySurge application where you'll be able to view the same source and target data that we're reviewing before we took a look at Visual Studio. So once you've created these unit tests within Visual Studio, you can then execute these from Visual Studio Team Services or from Team Foundation Server. What has to happen is the automated test needs to be associated with either a build or a test case in Visual Studio Team Services. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate to Visual Studio Team Services, and I'm in the test section, and right now I'm looking at a particular test plan. The name of this test plan is called QuerySurge with VS 2015 integration, and you'll see that this particular test plan has two test cases. One called ZCityAll, which is going to run all the query pairs against our ZCity source system, and then there's another one called ZCityProduct, which is just going to run the query pairs against the product table in that same source system. You'll see right now the outcome is active, which means they have not been executed yet, but are looking to be executed. If I open up one of these test cases, you'll see this is the test case ID up at the top, 255, and you'll see there's a tab that has associated automation, and if you go to that tab, you'll see it references the specific unit test that we ran in Visual Studio in the previous example. In order for this to work, the Visual Studio project has to be checked in to the source control within Visual Studio Team Services, and a build has to have been created that will generate the DLLs that are going to be referenced. So if I would like to go ahead and execute these tests, what I can do is if I want to execute all test cases within the suite, I can click on the arrow next to the suite name, and you'll see there is a run or run with options. Run with options lets you configure the options for the test execution. So you can see the type of run is going to be automated tests using a release environment. In order for you to do this, you'll need to select a valid build where your tests have been compiled. So I'm going to go ahead and select the last build that was successful. And then I need to choose a release definition and an environment. The release definition and the environment has already been pre-configured and set up. RTTS has instructions on how to do this setup process. If you go to the QuerySurge knowledge base, we have an article on how to connect Team Foundation Server or Visual Studio Team Services 2017 projects to QuerySurge. So we go step by step through all the instructions as far as setting up the Visual Studio project you need, checking it into Team Foundation Server, setting up the build necessary in order to do the execution, and getting all those different steps ready to go. So navigating back to our instance here, I select the release definition and the environment, and I click OK. And you'll see it says triggering a test to run, and then a button will enable that says view test run. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. And what that's going to do is it's going to open up the Run Explorer. It's going to say that we have 2 tests that are running. You'll see they're currently active. If you want to see exactly what's going on, you can go ahead and click this View Logs link. I'm going to open this up in a new tab so that we can see what's being executed. So what's happening now is the release is deploying the build code to a specific Visual Studio agent, which is running on a machine on our network. It's going to deploy the test code onto that machine. That machine that's being used as the Visual Studio agent also has to have the command line integration component of QuerySurge installed on it in order for it to work. So you can see it's downloading the different files that are required for this process, and once it deploys those files, then it's going to be ready to start the kickoff of the different Visual Studio tests that need to be run, which is wrapped around the different QuerySurge components. So you can see the test is now in progress. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate over to QuerySurge, and what you should see in a moment is the scenario being kicked off. So this particular test plan has 2 different scenarios. So it's going to run ZCity all, very similar to what we did in the Visual Studio example, where it's going to run those tests. The ZCity all scenario will have the 2 failures, as we saw before, and then we're going to run a second scenario, which is ZCity product, which should show up in a moment. And what you'll see in this case is that ZCity product will not have any failures. All of these tests should pass, and it will not have any failures when it's finished. So if I navigate back to the log, in a moment it should show that all the executions have finished and have been completed. Okay. And you'll see there's some red because it did finish with some errors during that particular run. And then if I click on the test option, you'll see the overall results of the test execution. So again, we had 2 tests, one that passed, one that failed. So you can see the breakdown in the test view. For the one that failed, if we click on the failing result, you'll see that we have the link to the HTML file, the same HTML file that we're looking at that was generated during the Visual Studio C# unit test that was executed before. So this is how the execution can be done if you want to use the test plan section of Visual Studio Team Services. The other way to execute QuerySurge is to execute it as part of a build. So if I go into the build section, you'll see I have this specific build called QS integration with Visual Studio 25 for continuous integration. So if I click on that build and I click the edit button, what you'll see is the components of the build, which are pretty much just to check out the code from the project, and then we have test assemblies which are going to specify which unit tests we want to be executed as part of this build. And you can see here in the test filter criteria, we're executing those same 2 unit tests, ZCity all tables test and ZCity product table test. So if I want to queue this up to execute, I can go ahead and hit queue. We're going to use the same agent as before, and I'm going to queue up that specific build to run. And then if we go ahead and watch the build process, what will happen when it gets to the test assemblies section of the build, it should execute those same unit tests that we had executed from the test plan section of Visual Studio Team Services. And if we navigate over to QuerySurge, again, you'll see the same two scenarios being executed. And once those scenarios are finished, we can navigate back to the build itself. You'll see if any of the tests within the build fail, it will indicate that the build failed overall. So you can see the results of that build, and then you'll see we have the test tab within the build, which will give us a very similar view to what you saw in the release plan results, where we have the two tests, the one passed that failed, and then of course any attachments or HTML files generated from that execution. So hopefully that gives you an overview of how you can execute QuerySurge tests and suites of tests from both Visual Studio and Visual Studio Team Services.